struggle, contend, wriggle. That alone is the sword of one who confronts death. These were the words that the man who changed the trajectory of Guts' life left him with, soon after meeting him for the first time. He appears from the darkness with no warning, as if he's manifesting from the shadows. He disappears just as quick, and more often than not, he's spouting off cryptically prophetic words that end up having major consequences for Guts, whether the latter realizes it or not. He's got the coolest armor design in manga history, and a horse that can pretty much fly without wings. He's wandered this earth for 1,000 years with only one goal in mind, the extermination of the God Hand. You guys know who we're talking about? It's Skull Knight. Ever since his introduction in Chapter 37, the Wandering Wraith has been one of Berserk's most popular characters because 1. He doesn't show up very often, and 2. Whenever he does, crap misses the fan and goes straight through the ceiling. He's been turning apostles into soup stock ingredients for literal centuries, and while he opposes the entire God Hand, there's one member in particular he seems to have beef with. But why is that the case? And who exactly is this enigmatic man? How did he become what he is today? And will we ever see him achieve the goal he's been working towards for close to a millennium? We'll answer all those questions, and some you might not have asked, in this video. This is the entire life of Skull Knight explored. The king of galloping death who conquered the world, the past life of and real-life inspiration for Skull Knight. Now, if you guys have been following this channel for any amount of time, you're pretty aware of our thoughts on Skull Knight's real identity. The guy debuts in Chapter 37, and a dozen or so chapters later, we're told the story of a king who wore a skull-shaped war helm into battle 1,000 years ago. Putting 2 and 2 together has never been tougher for a fandom, because Miura-sensei was exceptional at setting things up that seemed obvious, but felt ambiguous because of his phrasing. It wasn't until Chapter 363 that we finally got confirmation that yes, Skull Knight used to be Supreme King Gaiseric in his previous life. We'll be addressing each reference to his past as and when required, instead of going with the manga's chronology of things, so this video might feel like a whirlwind of speculation at first, but bear with us, it'll all make sense by the end. Let's look at the official information that we have about Skull Knight's previous life and how it all came undone. In Chapter 53, Princess Charlotte gives Guts and the rest of the Griffith rescue team a little history lesson about the Kingdom of Midland, as well as the tower in which her beloved was imprisoned. 1,000 years ago, the world of man was in chaos. There were no dynastic kingdoms yet. It was divided into a plethora of nation-states, tribes and fiefdoms, all fighting amongst one another to further their own causes. It was an age of warlords, and the constant fighting, food shortage and plague outbreaks killed 1/3 of the world's population. Things looked like they'd never improve, until one man appeared on the world stage, Supreme King Gaiseric. No one knew where he came from or how he raised an army as quickly as he did, but he swept over the continent of man and soon unified it into a single empire, a feat that hasn't been replicated since, though people have tried and are still trying. Unifying scores upon scores of warring classes and countries without bloodshed is practically impossible, because freedom is precious to every living person. Gaiseric had to use force to conquer the world, but apparently his methods were so ruthless that it earned him nicknames like the Demon King and the King of Galloping Death. But there was another reason for it. Whenever Gaiseric went into battle, he'd don fearsome armor with a skull-shaped war helm, which only served to demonize his legacy further. As for the downfall of the Skull King, that half of this history lesson comes from a fairy named after him. After bringing all of mankind under his rule, the Skull King constructed a massive capital city off the backs of labor that was gathered from all over his empire, and presumably worked to death in most cases. He then proceeded to live a life of extravagance and pleasure, all the while levying harder and harder taxes on the people he ruled over. Then one day, his sin stepped over God's threshold, and he sent down 5 angels to teach Gaiseric his lesson. With great earthquakes and lightning, the angels erased Gaiseric's capital from the face of the earth in a single day, with not a hint of it to be found in the aftermath. There exists some debate as to whether there were 5 angels present on that fateful day or 4, but we'll address that in due course. Now, how do we know that Gaiseric was real and not just a fairy tale character himself? Chapter 53 gives us that answer by showing us where his capital city disappeared off to. Princess Charlotte tells Guts and the rest that while she wasn't sure about God passing judgment on the Skull King's excesses, she knew for a fact that his city existed, because it was what slept at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth. Just to confirm Charlotte's assertion, Miura has Casca accidentally drop her torch into the gaping pit in the middle of the tower, which ends up showing us the remains of Gaiseric's capital, and thousands of corpses with the brand of sacrifice carved into them. We'll get to the reason behind that in a few minutes, but Charlotte wraps up her history lesson by explaining the role her family plays in all of this. After the collapse of the capital, Gaiseric's empire splintered into the many kingdoms of Berserk from the current timeline, like the Tudors, the Kushans, and of course, the Midlanders. The Kingdom of Midland was built upon the scorched earth that Gaiseric's city left behind, and while the Supreme King wasn't known to have any issue or official heir that anyone knew of, the Midland royal family claims descent from him. The Tower of Rebirth was built upon the precise spot where Gaiseric City fell into the earth, in an effort to conceal Midland's dark origins. Or at least, that's what Princess Charlotte's history teacher and the king himself had told her. There's a lot of merit to the claims that Charlotte makes because, well, for starters, Midland's royal family crest seems to have been carried over from Gaiseric's day. Their flag shows a crowned castle, seated in the midst of the heavens, which is represented through a quartered motif. The upper two sections display the sun and moon, and the bottom two display lightning and the stars. For a kingdom that pretty much only occupies the central region of the continent of man, Midland having such an ostentatious royal standard should be offensive to other nations, but it makes sense when you consider the lineage. Gaiseric's conquest of the world effectively made him the ruler of it, so his standard depicting a castle, his castle, in the midst of the heavens being carried forward by his so-called descendants, fits. But what doesn't fit is the armour we see in Charlotte's recollection of things, because it couldn't be further removed from the truth. In chapter 53, Gaiseric's armour is depicted as something of a combination between a Roman and an ancient Indian set of armour. The motifs on it are reflective of his reputation. There are many lions decorating the entire set, including one in the middle of the breastplate and one on the top of his war helm, where a pull-down visor would have been. This is representative of his status as the king of all mankind. There are two lions holding up a crest that has a sun resting within a crescent moon, representing his dominance over everything under the sky. If you're wondering how that's different from what we said about the lions, you'll learn that soon enough, so stay tuned. His shoulder pauldrons resembled the heads of dragons, and so did the covers for the eye openings of his horse's armor. This could be illustrative of the destruction he left behind at every battlefield he stepped on, thus creating his monstrous reputation. The lamella shirt underneath his breastplate reminds you of Roman legionnaires. The design on the inside of the gauntlet he's wearing is distinctly Indian, and we also see a cross-legged figure resting atop the snout of his horse, which suggests he might have a connection to the east. And finally, there are many women that adorn his war regalia. Let's start with his shield. A kite shield with two horn-like blades protruding from its rounded end, Gaiseric's protective plate had the visage of a screaming woman that had Medusa-like hair, smack dab in the middle. His war horse's facial armor bore the visage of an expressionless woman leaning forward, and a similar motif shows up on the kneecaps of his greaves. Around his waist, he wears a belt, with each section depicting the horrified face of a woman. Now, considering that all of these motifs are supposed to relate to his reputation, it can only mean that Gaiseric had an unhealthy obsession with women, right? Well, in reality, the women are what prove a link between him and Skull Knight, at least from a design standpoint. In chapter 37, we see that Skull Knight's armor isn't as ridiculously detailed as Gaiseric's, but his horse's armor has one uncanny detail that matches the Supreme King's steed. The piece of metal adorning the neck of Skull Knight's armor has a naked, expressionless woman, spreading her bat-like wings. To us, this was the first Easter egg that Miura planted about Skull Knight's real identity. Because the truth is, neither his current armor nor the one from chapter 53 are true depictions of what he wore into battle as a human. And what he wore into battle is connected to the real-life inspiration behind his character and another character from the series. So, let's get into that, shall we? Chapter 237 confirmed what everyone else thought when the Berserker armor debuted, that Skull Knight was in fact its previous owner. This explains a lot about Gaiseric's legacy as a whole, and why he had such a fearsome reputation. The part about him going into battle wearing a skull-shaped helmet is true, but his ruthless and merciless battle style wasn't just an army thing. Turns out, Gaiseric was using the Berserker to conquer the world, and if you guys recall how Guts became when he goes berserk, then you know that his rep was deserved. But beyond just being the main character's spiritual predecessor, and trust us, there's a lot to say on that front, this is where the real-life inspiration behind the Supreme King comes into play. The name Gaiseric wasn't picked by Miura on a whim. He was a man who made many deliberate choices when incorporating real-world history into his series, like naming Midland's enemies Tudors, for instance. In our Entire Life of Griffith video, we explained to you how Griffith's name was also deliberately chosen, as Griffith in Welsh means prince, and we don't need to tell you what a prince becomes when he grows up. The name Gaiseric doesn't have any significant word meaning by itself. However, it's attached to a man whose reputation was quite similar to the Skull King's. That man is the 5th century Vandal king Gaiseric, who's alternatively known as Gaiseric. Before he rose to power, he was the half-brother of a king who was on the brink of being annihilated by his Visigothic enemies. During his reign, the Vandals prospered and became a force that challenged the might of Rome itself, and not just in the West. Gaiseric was a military genius who used deception and diplomacy in equal measures to carve out a kingdom for his people. He took the Vandals across the Mediterranean, from Hispania Baetica to Rome's North African provinces, and quickly conquered them all. He also deployed several ships in the Mediterranean, which would give him dominance over all naval affairs from Gibraltar to Tripolitania. In 435 AD, Gaiseric sent his son Huneric to Rome as a political hostage, who was betrothed to the royal lady Eudocia in return for Huneric's father being recognized as king of the lands he'd conquered. The Romans also feared Gaiseric attacking the city of Carthage, which was effectively their last outpost in North Africa. For 4 years, the Vandal king played the game of peace with his Western Roman allies. Then, in 439, he captured Carthage in a surprise attack which made the Vandals the strongest authority in North Africa and the Mediterranean Sea. He also attacked mainland Italy when the Western Romans were engaged by the Huns and Attila's sudden betrayal. But those efforts were repelled, and another peace treaty was signed in 442 AD, which consolidated the Vandal king's authority. When Petronius Maximus betrayed Emperor Valentinian III and married off Eudocia to his own son, Gaiseric saw this as a violation of that peace treaty we just mentioned and marched on mainland Italy, sacking Rome in 455 AD. This sack was so thorough that it spawned the term vandalism, which was seen as an especially violent and degrading act well into the Enlightenment age. Gaiseric repelled Majorian's attempt to take back Western Rome's African province, and then smashed the combined might of the West and the East in the Battle of Cape Bon, where the Vandals used fire ships to dismantle an incoming fleet of well over 1,100 vessels. He concluded a peace treaty with the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno in 474 AD and died a year after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, having played a central role in it. Because he was a Vandal, his kingdom was classified alongside the other barbarian kingdoms that spawned in Central Europe like mushrooms during the first millennium. But this reputation isn't the only thing that inspired Miura to name his supreme king after the Vandal king. The Vandals themselves were suspected to be a Germanic people. Their ancestors were said to have moved from Scandinavia to mainland Europe, staying where modern-day Poland is for a long while. Over time, they immigrated into Roman Empire territory, eventually ending up at the tip of the Iberian Peninsula. But even though the Vandal kingdom was based out of North Africa, its roots were in Scandinavia. So whenever you see Gaiseric depicted in portraits and images, you see him looking more or less like a Viking. That could explain why he was so good at naval engagement, which was the primary force of power in the Mediterranean at the time. But this is also where things start aligning with Miura's series, because his Gaiseric went above and beyond what the real-life Gaiseric accomplished. In order to launch a conquest as massive as his was, Gaiseric needed to account for everything possible, and that included the arcane. In his day and age, the physical and metaphysical were deeply intertwined. Magic was not a taboo, it was practiced openly, and many spirits were worshipped as deities. If a tribe or a nation had mages or priests skilled at harnessing those spirits, and Gaiseric only took humans with him on his campaign, he'd be in jeopardy. And besides, the Berserker armor wasn't created on the mainland. It was stored there for safekeeping by Skull Knight, and it was likely created on the magical island of Skellig, considering that its creator, Hanar, lives there. Gaiseric must have known that he needed to get the strongest mage in the world on his side for his dream to become a reality, so at some point, he set sail for Skellig Island. Whether he approached the island from the east or the west remains unclear, but it's likely that he did so from the east, because Skellig is based on a real-world Irish legend. According to that legend, this land of wizards is located off the western coast of Ireland, and if a Scandinavian were to approach it, it'd be from the east. Also, we've just seen Guts and his crew arrive in Kushan lands from Skellig, when they set sail from Vritannis, which is on the other side of the world. It's possible that Gaiseric took the opposite route for his conquest, because that'd explain why no Western records have any mention of him before his unannounced arrival. How do you anticipate a massive fleet of humans and wizards coming to besiege your lands from an island in the middle of nowhere? You don't, and that's why the invading force seems so overwhelming, and why no one knew about his army before it showed up. Also, time moves differently on Skellig, so that must have added to the surprise factor of his arrival, because it's possible that to the outside world, Gaiseric just vanished for a few years. As for whether we have any proof that Gaiseric actually attacked Skellig, in chapter 359, we see Casca training with a few golems that were outfitted with Viking armor. Turns out, these were actually Vikings that had been turned into golems by the ruler of Elfhelm when they tried to attack her village. She even uses the root term for the word viking to describe these gents. Serpico quietly notes just how chilling her casual mention of magicking them into golems was, but this is our first hint that Gaiseric did in fact invade Skellig at some point, and as if to prove that, Miura has Skull Knight show up at the end of that chapter. But we can see how you might think that proves nothing, so we'll give you some more proof. In chapter 361, we're told two things that pretty much confirm Gaiseric attacked Skellig. The first is the fact that a large nation from the mainland invaded Skellig at some point in the distant past, and that the wicker men that Elfhelm used for its defense were created from the sacrificed souls of those invaders. The second is the fact that Skull Knight knows Guru Gedfring from his previous life, and he even recalls his father's name. The man was called Vid, and did often bring Gedfring along with him for audiences with the king. Skull Knight notes that clever youngster has come far in the world from those days, and this interaction pretty much confirms that, yep, Gaiseric attacked Skellig, came to Elfhelm, and acquired the Berserker armor. Gedfring could have been a part of his entourage from the mainland, but even if he was an Elfhelm citizen, clearly the king took a shine to him. He was already a pretty successful military leader before arriving at the island, because there's at least half a dozen wicker men still in storage, and each of them takes dozens of souls to create. But like we told you a few minutes ago, his war wasn't just to conquer the human world. The reason Berserk Gaiseric standard shows a crowned castle dominating the heavens was because he wanted it all, and that includes magical power. He wanted to rule not just the humans, but the arcane as well, and create a truly unified continental empire. If he were to just focus on establishing a human empire, it'd create several divides within the community he wanted to build. So he had clear objectives for coming to this place, and clearly he accomplished those objectives because Gaiseric went on to establish his empire following his departure. When Serpico first saw Guts using the Berserker armor, he was reminded of the ancient Berserker warriors who were set to kill everything that stood in their path, including their friends. Berserkers come from Viking legends, and now that we know what Gaiseric wore into battle, it's likely that they got that reputation in the Berserk verse because of him. This is also doubly impressive when you consider just how eager the armor is to kill and devour its wearer, as it must have taken Gaiseric several years to piece his empire together, regardless of him being the Berserker. This means he was able to somehow control it much better than Guts, because otherwise he'd have lost his life mid-campaign, were he as tempestuous as the Black Swordsman. But we all know that it's practically impossible to control the Berserker armor all by your lonesome. A magical presence is crucial to ensure that a Berserker warrior doesn't go out of control. For Guts, that's Shirka. Flora's disciple has done a great job of ensuring that she and her friends don't become collateral damage in Guts' pursuit of vengeance. For Skull Knight, that was likely Flora, because he compares Guts and Shirka's relationship to his own with the Old Witch in Chapter 237. So, there you have it. That's the real-life inspiration behind the mythical progenitor of the Berserk storyline, and why his purported reputation from Chapter 53 makes sense, considering every clue we've been drip-fed across the series. But all of this was just a breakdown of how Gaiseric gained his empire, and why he was remembered with such fear, and not at all before he appeared on the world stage. Now it's time to get into the downfall of his kingdom, and why women are so closely associated with his character design, both in remembrance and reality. The loss of his love and the birth of the foe of the Inhumans, how Gaiseric became Skull Knight. In the previous section, we established how Gaiseric came to establish his empire, and why he was able to take the world unawares. Guts likens him to Griffith, in fact, when he first hears of the man's achievements, but then changes his mind upon hearing about his skull-shaped war helm. Now we'll talk about how his empire collapsed and the players involved in said collapse, because it sets the course for the entire series. We've pretty much addressed what Gaiseric did before and after arriving at Elfhelm, but it's what he does during his stay that forms the basis of his downfall. For starters, Gaiseric acquires the Berserker armor, which is a great weapon for his purpose, but it also comes with a lethal side effect. Continued use of the Berserker armor strips away the user's 5 senses, until they can't do anything anymore, unless it kills the user first. Eyesight diminishes, taste fades away from the tongue, the body shivers, and you can't control it. Guts has only used the Berserker armor for a few months, and his condition has deteriorated to the point where he can no longer use Dragon Slayer without strapping it to his arm. That's how much control he's lost over his nervous system. Gaiseric, while better at handling the armor, was likely not immune to its effects, and over time, he'd have come to rely on it for even basic movement, much like Guts. Now, this itself doesn't sound all that bad, because that just means he'd have to keep wearing the armor for the rest of his life. But the Berserker armor breaks both body and mind. The reason it turns its wearer into an unstoppable demon warrior is that the Berserker armor is imbued with a rather ominous odd. This odd is constantly trying to get the user to lose control over his psyche, so it can bleed the world to its heart's content. If a person yields to the armor's odd, it takes control of them, and then the only thing that can break them out is an extremely powerful magic user. We're talking someone at Gedfring's level, because as good as Shirka is, she isn't entirely in control of Guts' Berserker situation. She gets help from the Moonlight Boy without her knowledge, but that's a whole other conversation. Considering he had an entire continent to conquer, Gaiseric couldn't afford to be falling prey to the armor that easily, and yet war tended to bring the worst out of people. So he decided that he was going to add mages to his entourage because 1. They'd help him out with tackling his enemy's magic, and 2. They'd keep him in check so he didn't go rampaging through his own army. Some of these mages could have been an extremely young Gedfring and Flora, but one that was definitely with him was the Lady Priestess of the Cherry Blossoms. This obscure figure was reportedly the strongest magician on the island of Skellig, and Flora used to be her disciple. Because Flora was Gaiseric's Shirka, you might be thinking that this is why this lady is important. That's not the case. The real reason is that she was the love of King Gaiseric's life, and when he left Elfhelm, he took her with him. The Lady Priestess must have contributed to him staying sane and mostly human to a large extent, because that's usually how arcane things work in Berserk. People with strong connections to other people are able to get them out of situations that seem hopeless otherwise, and if Flora ever failed to restrain the king, Her mistress was sure to be at hand. That love kept his soul anchored to its true self, but no matter what Gaiseric did, it only slowed down the berserker armor's effects. Stories about his capital city becoming a den of pleasure and sin might just be true, because the berserker slowly chips away at its wearer's psyche, exposing the darkest desires, and constantly encourages them to indulge those desires. For as lavish as it was, Gaiseric's capital was also a technological marvel. The streets were all paved in cobblestone. The architecture was reminiscent of classic Greek and Roman architecture, with motifs from religious beliefs the world over being represented in its design. Guts lived at a time when fire hazards usually meant that the place on fire was lost forever. But Gaiseric's city had the modern equivalent of fire extinguishers all over. Clearly, the Skull King didn't build his capital mindlessly. He built it to become a beacon of civilization and technology, and he did it all within his own lifetime, which would be impossible without the help of his mage friends. But like most other ancient cultures, when they start declining, they decline hard. And while Gaiseric was able to erect a monument to his conquest of the world in the form of his city, he wasn't able to get rid of elements that opposed him nonetheless. One of these elements would eventually become the cause of his downfall. In chapter 138, we hear a tale about Gaiseric and a certain sage. Apparently, during the final innings of his reign, a sage started proclaiming the many sins of Gaiseric's rule to the world. His voice became loud enough for the Supreme King to take a personal interest in him, and Gaiseric had the guy imprisoned in the Tower of Conviction, which would have been a part of his sprawling capital city back in the day. The Supreme King tortured the man in every way imaginable to mankind, and some they couldn't even think of. And yet the sage kept proclaiming his sins to God until one day his voice was heard and an angel was made to descend. It's possible that this event is the reason the confusion between how many angels destroyed Gaiseric's capital exists, because according to this story, the angel appeared to that sage first. For a long time, it was unclear as to who exactly this person was, because the story was relayed so cryptically. But then chapter 362 gave us the truth about the downfall of Gaiseric's city. It wasn't God who smote it down, it was the God Hand. Remember how we told you guys that when Casca's torch fell into the gaping pit inside the Tower of Rebirth, that it showed us several bodies bearing the brand of sacrifice on their heads? Well, chapter 362 shows us the creator of those sacrifices, Void. In that chapter, which is pretty much a flashback to the final moments of Skull Knight's life, we get to see just how his capital actually collapsed. It turns out, it's a mixture of fairy tales and falsehood. Yeah, it's true that the city disappeared overnight, and yeah, it's true that there were 5 angelic beings present at the scene, not 4. But one of those beings is Void, and he has to be the sage that Gaiseric was torturing in the Tower of Conviction, because just look at the guy, and now think of the stories we've told you about the Supreme King's ruthlessness. A man losing his mind to the berserker armor would be fully capable of making another man look exactly like Void does, especially if he was crossed in some manner. The real identity of Void is unknown, but what we can say is that he's a man who used to believe in Gaiseric, or at least the vision that he inspired, because his birth event was the sacrifice of the Supreme King's entire capital city. In chapter 362, we see Gaiseric wearing the berserker armor and cutting his way through what looks like Tentacle Town. Thousands of evil, creepy tentacles have swarmed what looks like city blocks. They've covered the streets and are even blocking out the skies. From the middle of these tentacles, hairy apostle-like creatures start manifesting, but the Skull King slices them to death. He makes his way to what looks like an altar in the shape of a closed fist, and when he gets there, he sees Void, flanked by 4 other demonic-looking entities and the Abyss lurking in the background. Gaiseric wants to snatch that stupid exposed brain off his head, but he has to look down at what he needs to protect, which is a dying lady priestess of the cherry blossoms, with the brand of sacrifice etched into her arm. This, combined with the fact that the corpses we saw in chapter 53 can't be related to the Lady Priestess, bring us to the conclusion that Void's sacrifice was Gaiseric's capital. As for why he did it, there could be many reasons, but we think it was because he became disillusioned with his leader's vision. Once Gaiseric established his capital, Void couldn't bear his excesses. Where he'd once seen him as a revolutionary, he now saw him as a degenerate, and someone that was destroying his own city by being a risk to its safety. Once he felt the Supreme King's gratitude in the form of enslavement and torture, he knew that evil was the only truth in this world, and so his call for salvation was answered by the idea of evil, which made him what he is today. Gaiseric, of course, knew nothing about any of this, and he just wanted to keep his lover and his city alive. He fought the demonic manifestations that sprung up beside him as his city descended into the abyss, and with his will to live lost to the brand, Gaiseric gave in to the armor. The berserker devoured him as he fought those tentacles and any other monsters he could lay his hands on, and when the last drop of blood was spent from his body, his physical existence ended. But his spiritual existence somehow continued to burn with the fire of vengeance, and so he took on a brand new face and identity for his brand new task, annihilating the God Hand. The Skull King might have died that fateful day the black sun shone upon the earth for the first time, but it led to the birth of the Skull Knight, Now, we're not sure if he made it back to Elfhelm for this, or if it happened near the wreckage of his capital after he bled out in the Berserker armour. But at some point, Skull Knight's soul was transferred from that suit of armour to a brand new one, also created by Hanar. This new armour was shaped in the form of a skeleton, because the dwarven blacksmith considered it to be a coffin for Gaiseric's still breathing soul. This is just our speculation, but when a man bleeds out in the Berserker armour, he doesn't exactly die. What likely happens is his life force gets subsumed within the armour, because we don't know if you notice this or not, but the Berserker armour constantly asks Guts to yield himself to it. It encourages his worst thoughts, almost as if it wants to assimilate with him. Because it's a highly spiritual object, the Berserker armour works best when its emotions are aligned with its users, and we all know how important emotion and the unconscious mind is in Berserk. Since Hanar is the creator of both armors, he knowing how to perform the soul transfer should be a given, and Flora likely helped him do it. A mausoleum for his lost lover was erected within a cove filled with cherry blossoms on Elfhelm, and Skull Knight got a magical steed to match his new nature as a dweller of the interstice. He was no longer a person that could walk the earth when the sun was out. His destiny was to lurk in the shadows, be summoned by the night, and disappear before the sun appears, because he was now the equivalent of a vengeful spirit. Hanar added crown-like spikes to his new armor's helm, perhaps as a reminder of the human he used to be, but it wasn't much use. The Berserker armor heavily altered Gaisieric's human soul after his death, because as Skull Knight, the only things driving him are vengeance and hatred. He's aware of his previous life to a certain extent, otherwise he wouldn't be able to recognize Gedfring upon reaching the village again, or be in touch with Flora well after 1,000 years. Speaking of Flora, she was banished from Elfhelm shortly after all this went down for violating some sort of taboo. Now this could be related to Gaiseric's transformation into Skull Knight, considering that was pretty much dark soul magic. But we don't think that was bad enough to warrant banishment. What we do think would be bad enough to cause that is if Flora tried to resurrect her dead mistress, and succeeded. In chapter 363, Shirka and Guts both note that the Flowerstorm monarch of Elfhelm, Danann, looks a lot like the Lady Priestess of Cherry Blossoms. But Danann is an elf, and the lady was a human. How could they be related? Well, to put it simply, Flora resurrected her mistress as Danann and was banished for the same. We say this because there's a particular line about Skull Knight that connects to Danann, if you can believe it. In chapter 142, Skull Knight meets Puck for the first time, and the elf picks up a curious sensation from him. He thinks to himself that Skull Knight kinda feels like an elf, which is likely because he was resurrected using Elfhelm's magic. Flora just took it a step further with her mistress and made her a whole-ass elf, which proves she was far more powerful than we could ever imagine. Unlike Skull Knight, however, Danann doesn't remember anything about her past life, and if you ask us, her resurrection is what got Flora banned from Elfhelm. Gaiseric clearly trusted his Shirka more than the crones of the Mage Village, because he gave his old armor to her for keepsake. Once he'd put his affairs in order to the best of his ability, he got to work on fulfilling his new life's ambition. The Wraith that wandered for centuries. What Skull Knight did before the main timeline and his rivalry with Zod. From the moment he got seared with the brand of sacrifice, King Gaiseric's life belonged to the interstice. And yeah, Gaiseric was branded alongside the rest of his city, because think about it, why would Void leave him out of that sacrifice when he was the cause of it? But he could only fully explore it as Skull Knight, because 1. He no longer had a physical body, and 2. Everything we just established in the previous section. Still, just because he now existed on the literal borderline between life and death, it didn't make Skull Knight's task of hunting down the God Hand any easier. See, Guts had a roadmap to follow when he became a struggler. 4 God Hand members had already been born before Griffith's eclipse occurred. He'd fought at least a couple apostles before the eclipse, and given them a pretty good run for the money, if you ask us. But Guts' roadmap was laid down by Skull Knight, because he was the OG God Hand hunter, and he had nothing to go off of. Void was the first in a cycle of 5 that would only be completed 1,000 years later. Apostles didn't seem to be a thing before Gaiseric's empire collapsed, and if they were, they certainly weren't the servants of the God Hand, because that was created with Void's reincarnation. So Skull Knight had to focus on every little detail that he could pick up in order to piece together a strategy that could defeat literal gods. For starters, his brand of sacrifice is likely how he knows how to detect apostles, and why he can guide Guts on that same path, considering the astral effects of the brand should still be active no matter what form Gaiseric's soul inhabits. So long as it doesn't enter the abyss, it'll forever feel the sting of the brand in the presence of evil, and that becomes the first piece of knowledge he collects. Over the course of the next few centuries, Skull Knight launches a guerrilla warfare campaign against the God Hand, because that's pretty much all he can do. We've mostly seen him show up on nights of the full moon, which must mean his manifestation is contingent on the lunar cycle. Full moons hold a specific significance when it comes to the arcane, because that's when spirits and magic are at their strongest. It makes sense that Skull Knight can only operate on such nights, with the only other times we see him manifesting being when a temporal junction point is at hand. As an interstitial entity, Skull Knight spends a lot of time in the astral physical world. He doesn't just wander about aimlessly in there. His goal at the end of the day is to take down the order established by the God Hand, and to do that, he needs to address the core issue, which isn't them, it's causality. When he was a human being, Gaiseric used to probably think that he could make the world bend to his will with the berserker armour in his possession and the strongest sorcerers by his side. But that perception was shattered by the day Void changed his life, to the point he realized how foolish he'd been as a man and a king. He tells Guts as much, saying that what he'd witnessed in that blood memory in chapter 362 was the death of a foolish king and the birth of a wraith, wandering through the endless night, and he says it's because he realizes his life didn't play out the way he wanted it to. It played out the way causality had willed it. Causality, fate, the destiny of each person in this world, whatever you want to call it, it isn't a random thing in Berserk. It's threads upon threads upon threads, interwoven through generations to create moments that tip the world further toward evil. There are many ways to interpret this flow. Mages do it by reading star alignments and gazing into crystal balls, but the ones with the clearest perception of causality are the God Hand. The God Hand receives their power directly from the entity responsible for causality, which is the idea of evil. Their perception of its flow is near perfect, to the point they seem almost prescient, and because they can basically see the future, the God Hand can set up events in such a way that they influence that future. The Conviction arc of Berserk is the biggest example of this, where we see at least 3 God Hand members actively shaping the way the world works through their influence, but they're pretty much always active within every human being's unconscious mind. In order to beat his enemies, he needs to know their next move, and so, for the next 1,000 years or so, Skull Knight spends his time honing his skills at interpreting the flow of causality. He obviously gets pretty good at it by the time the main series rolls around, but given that he never manages to kill Void, and also the birth of Conrad, Ubik and Slan before Griffith, it tells you that even he still lacks the means to actually defeat the God Hand. We'll get to how he fixes that problem in a few sections, so stick around. But his time slaying apostles isn't spent all in vain, because he does gain something from it, a worthy adversary. Although 3 God Hand births into his one-sided war for revenge, Skull Knight had made no progress on killing them, but he disrupted their workings enough times for all apostle kind to fear him. The Wandering Wraith is the foe of the Inhumans, and that means all Inhumans are on his hit list, not just Void. Now, usually, dispatching an apostle to the Abyss is easy work for Skull Knight, but a few decades before the birth of the 4th God Hand member, an apostle was born that he couldn't just slice and dice his way through. The Immortal One, Nosferatu Zod. By the time the main series begins, Zod has lived for over 300 years according to his own estimations. In that time, he slaughtered thousands of humans and apostles alike, in his search of the definition of absolute strength. The closest he's ever come to finding his man is whenever he fights Skull Knight. Ever since he began interpreting the flow of causality, Skull Knight has started showing up at important temporal junctions to try and prevent whatever damage he could prevent. He clearly couldn't kill the God Hand, because his weapon, while formidable, was no match for the reality-warping powers of those demons. But he had to try, because there was no one who understood what they were and how they operated as an entity better than Skull Knight. This also put several apostles in his crosshairs, but the only one that actually pushed him back was the Immortal One. We're not sure whether the first chronological encounter was similar to the one they had on the pages of the manga, but considering their individual goals, the meeting was pretty much inevitable. Skull Knight wanted to hunt down the God Hand, and Zod was looking to fight the absolute strongest being possible, even if that person was one of his kind. As an apostle, he knows the God Hand are supreme, and they don't manifest in the physical world except on special occasions anyway, so expecting to test himself against them would be unrealistic. But lucky for him, he has the next best thing in Skull Knight, who sits right underneath those demonic angels in Berserk's power hierarchy, food chain, whatever you want to call it. The Immortal One is the strongest apostle ever created, without a shadow of doubt. If you guys have any, you should check out our Zod anatomy video, because those concerns will end up getting mitigated. And yet, every time they meet, both Skull Knight and Zod can't put the other one down. If Zod was present at the 4th God Hand's birth, he likely played a significant role in holding Skull Knight back, thus kicking off their iconic rivalry. Following that failure, Skull Knight went back to the drawing board because he must have known that the next eclipse would be the last one. He began searching through the causal current for any means by which he could finally defeat the God Hand, and he found those means in the man we know as Guts. First contact, the strugglers converge. For a guy that doesn't put stock into things like prophecy and such, the Black Swordsman sure finds himself stuck in the middle of quite a few of them. The first time he heard one directly was from the mouth of Skull Knight's eternal rival Zod. In Chapter 5 of Berserk, Zod warned Guts that if he could be said to be a true friend of Griffith's, then he should take heed, because when Griffith's ambition falls, an inescapable death would pay Guts a visit. Guts didn't think much of it because in Chapter 12, he learned that Griffith doesn't think of him as a friend at all. And so there was no way that prophecy crap was gonna come true, right? Guts left the Band of the Falcon with the intention of becoming a man that Griffith could call friend, even though he never quite deleted the incident with Zod from his mind because he truly admired the man. As weird as it might be for you to hear, Griffith was the only male role model that accepted Guts for who he was, and not just that, lavished praise and glory on him in his own fashion. He felt indebted to Griffith in a way he can probably never verbalize, so he wanted to show the man that no matter what he thought, they were friends. But he, being defiant of things like fate and destiny, can only work out for him for so long before they eventually find their way back to him. And that's exactly what happens when Skull Knight shows up for the first time in the manga. As soon as he met Zod, the wheels were put into motion for Guts' departure, whether he was aware of it or not. Tasting the Immortal One's power made him realize that there were things he still couldn't defeat by himself in this world, and in Chapter 48, we learn that his true desire is to become as great of a swordsman as he possibly can be. But before that realization strikes him, he has to go through his own trials and tribulations, chief of which involved separating himself from Griffith. Guts was extremely grateful to the Falcon for a lot of things in life, but he knew that he needed to do this thing on his own if he wanted to discover his own dream. So he fought for his own freedom, and having won it, left his friends in the snow with a simple farewell. Little did he know that his departure set into motion the exact sequence of events that Zod was trying to warn him about, because shortly after Guts' departure, Griffith's ambition fell. He couldn't cope with losing his greatest weapon, so he fast-tracked seducing Princess Charlotte and got caught in the process. Of course, Guts had no idea this would happen, and Zod didn't exactly tell him what he foresaw coming. But you know who did? That's right, it was Skull Knight. On his first night alone in nearly 3 years, Guts was feeling paranoid. He chastised himself for feeling that way, considering the life he'd lived, but soon started ruminating on whether he was yet again throwing away an irreplaceable thing. He was questioning whether his dream was even his own, and he got his answer in the form of Skull Knight's arrival. Initially, Guts thought Zod had come back to settle their score, because the presence he felt was extremely similar to the Immortal One's, but it became clear that this was someone else when Guts completely misread his movements and swung his own sword around like a hapless child. The Black Swordsman was baffled at the prospect of someone trumping his perception, but in all fairness to him, how can he accurately discern the position of someone that technically isn't even there? Skull Knight reveals himself by stepping out of the interstice once he sees Guts has cozied up on the ground, proceeds to change his entire life with one exchange. The Wandering Wraith takes one look at Guts and can already tell that his departure from the Band of the Falcon means the gears have already begun turning. Guts was instrumental to Griffith's rise to success. He was the reason the past 3 years of the Band of the Falcon's existence had been untouchable. Griffith was an undefeated war general, but his strategies benefited immensely by having a madman like Guts on his side. No offense. After becoming a Viscount, Griffith came to rely on Guts even more, as he was the first person that Griffith involved in his schemes of assassinating his political opposition. In a way, he was indispensable, and had become intrinsically tied into Griffith's lifelong ambition. So, when he left, like Zod predicted, Griffith's ambition collapsed. And now Skull Knight was seeing the same truth, but relaying it to the party that was going to face the God Hand and not join them, perhaps in the hope of gaining an ally. He calls Guts Struggler and cautions him to take heed. He warns him of the eclipse and tells him that his friends and his unkingly half would all be gathered in that place, alongside those unseen of the fleshless flesh. The guy had the foresight to call out Griffith's hypocrisy of thinking he could become a great king, because he was planning to build his kingdom upon a bed of lies and deception, and such a foundation can be unraveled with ease. Having been a monarch himself, Skull Knight knows what it takes to accomplish the feat Griffith was trying to replicate. The guy failed the test of kingship. His friends is a reference to the Band of the Falcon. The unseen could be a reference to the Apostles or the God Hand, more likely the second one, and that place is clearly a reference to the site of the eclipse. Skull Knight obviously knows a lot about astral happenings, considering his skill at interpreting the flow of causality, but what's also to be noted here is his knowledge of Griffith's life as well as Guts. Right after informing him of the eclipse, Skull Knight gives him a sliver of hope in the form of a charge. He tells Guts that because he was born from a corpse, he excelled at escaping death. So if he wanted to survive the torrent of madness and death that was to come, he must struggle, he must contend, he must wriggle, and he must keep fighting. That alone is the sword of one who confronts death. Guts wasn't even paying attention to this part of the monologue. He was still trying to figure out how the hell did this guy know about his early childhood, because that's something he's never discussed with anyone. Even with Casca, he never addressed the fact that he was born from a corpse, and that for his formative years, most people saw him as a cursed child. But this random dude that he'd never seen before and felt like a monster and was spouting off a prophecy similar to Zod's did, and that completely threw him off. Because he's a great warrior, Guts still picked up all the information that was necessary from the warning. But this encounter is a testament to how far Skull Knight has progressed when it comes to interpreting the flow of causality. He can now recognize the major players of its twisted games well before they figure out their major players and warn them beforehand. And what makes it doubly interesting is the fact that his parting words to Guts are pretty much a spoiler for what goes down during the eclipse. As he leaves the man behind, Skull Knight says to himself that, "In the abyss of despair, only he who stands up with broken sword in hand." His voice trails off for a moment, and then he wonders to himself that perhaps Guts could be the man with the broken sword. The way he phrased the first half of this private musing sounded pretty prophetic, not just in nature, but in its structure and cadence as well. The reason for that is simple. It was a prophecy that Skull Knight gleaned off the flow of causality to help himself. This is only the first time that we see him speak cryptic words that sound like hidden truths, and you'll see what we mean by that in a minute. For now, let's move on to the event that sort of changed both of their lives, the eclipse. The savior of the day, but at what cost? Skull Knight and the eclipse. Even before the actual ceremony was triggered, Skull Knight was working toward disrupting it, or seeking ways to salvage the aftermath, whichever you believe based on his actions. And speaking of actions, let's talk about them, because Skull Knight makes a lot of moves in the short period of time that he has to do something about the eclipse. In Chapter 52, he shoos off a bunch of apostles that had gathered for a snack and wanted to eat the reserve unit of the Falcons before eating the main course. They just turn their attention to little Ricket when SK shows up and reminds them that they had no time to amuse themselves because haste was needed. He gives Ricky a long look, as if trying to discern what role he'd play in the grand game to come. But whatever he understands, we're not made privy to. We just see him and his horse casually leap off a tree branch as if it were an everyday thing. His next appearance is in Chapter 80, when the eclipse is in full swing, and he's making his latest attempt at trying to stop the God Hand. By now, the demons had pretty much discerned his pattern, so it wasn't much of a surprise to see Zod standing outside the eclipse, eager to meet his old rival. Skull Knight misread his intention, though. He thought that Zod had been sent here to guard the site from him. He wasn't exactly a dull shoe in the box, you see. He was aware that his enemies were aware of his ways. What he failed to account for was his adversary's personal nature, because eclipse or not, Zod was never going to pass up an opportunity to fight Skull Knight. He couldn't prove to himself that he was the strongest without defeating the Wandering Wraith, and him showing up whenever the God Hand executes a major scheme just works out in Zod's favor. Their first on-screen encounter is a comfortable victory for Skull Knight, so much so that Ricket can't believe someone more skilled than the fabled god of the battlefield exists. SK takes off Zod's left arm before entering the eclipse site, and exit it in what feels like the very next moment. But remember, time works differently within an interstice. Once he enters the eclipse, Skull Knight moves very quickly, but he makes a couple of stops before making his escape. The moment he breaks in, he tries to get a cheap shot in on Void. Skull Knight thrusts his sword full in Void's face, but the Archangel of the God Hand opens up a spatial portal and redirects the blade back at him. Skull Knight clearly has experience fighting Void, because he anticipates it and blocks it with his shield just in time. It could also be his warrior instinct, but we'd like to think that after spending 1,000 years gathering all the info that he could on his enemies, Skull Knight would be aware of such things. They lock eyes for a brief moment, as if acknowledging their entire history in that moment, before Skull Knight sets off to do what he came to do. He hops off the God Hand altar in like 4 steps, and kills every apostle that tries to block his path. When Griffith, freshly reborn as the God Hand Femto, tries to kill him using his new powers, Skull Knight moves quicker and dodges before Femto's ability even hits. The fact that he's practically a newborn also helps, because while he's preoccupied with understanding what he just did, Skull Knight scoops up Guts and Casca and leaps out of the eclipse. Femto tries to reach out for Guts according to the panel descriptions in Chapter 88, but evidently his powers have a limited range. Most of the other God Hand members rejoice at just what happened because it broke the monotony of them knowing everything. After Skull Knight's departure, Ubik exclaims that everything that's just transpired was completely unexpected, confirming that the God Hand didn't foresee this coming. He brushes it off as being extremely minute in the grand scope of things, and Slan admits that while they can interpret the flow of causality better than most, they weren't gods themselves. She then looks at Void and wonders whether he saw this coming, and the Archangel's silence speaks 1,000 words, because he clearly did. How do we know that? Because Skull Knight says as much, shortly after exiting the interstice. Once he makes his way out, he notices that the kid he saved from those apostles had found his way to the eclipse as well. Normally, he wouldn't pay attention to such people, but he notices the elf dust in Ricky's bag. Understanding that he too must be connected to things, Skull Knight entrusts Guts and Casca's emergency treatment to Ricket, considering they had more pressing concerns on hand, namely Nosferatu Zod. A second hadn't passed since Skull Knight's emergence that Zod was behind him. reminding him that this victory didn't mean their score was settled. The wandering wraith acknowledged his sentiment, likely because he was too eager to settle things once and for all, but then he said something that he'd never said before. He asked Zod to consider delaying their battle. This is because to him, Guts and Casca's survival was more important. It's true that an element of survivor's guilt is at play with Skull Knight's stance on saving Guts and Casca. As Gaiseric, he failed his lover and his people when Void blindsided him with the sacrifice. After learning what the mechanics of becoming associated with demonkind involved, we're sure Skull Knight tried saving most sacrifices that he came across, if any, during his mission. Guts and Casca could remind him of his own situation, considering they were lovers too, and Skull Knight lost his own during the first eclipse. But the truth lies in his words to Rickard after handing over Guts and Casca, when he simply says that these two aren't meant to die yet. This tells us that Skull Knight had had a peek at both of the futures, and knows of the day that they'll die, which brings up a question we'll address in more detail in a later section. For now, let's get back to his request, because while Zod initially reacts as expected, he ends up acquiescing for a single reason. He sees that Guts made it out of the eclipse, alive. The Black Swordsman was the only human being to have ever given him a decent fight in his 300 years as an apostle. Zod was disappointed that he couldn't finish their first fight because he realized Guts' role in Griffith's ascension. He thought that this rivalry would never get off the ground because Guts would die within the eclipse. So when he survived, Zod's delight was unparalleled. As a man that only values strength, he was intrigued by the prospect of a mere human walking through the domain of darkness that was the life of a branded individual. And so Zod agreed to Skull Knight's temporary truce, and even advised him to shake the spot, because with the eclipse over, the other apostles would come spilling out soon. Skull Knight leaves with Guts, Casca, and Rickard in tow, and brings them to Godot's hut, because that was the closest thing to a safe sanctuary for the first two. As branded individuals, Guts and Casca now resided in the interstice, and would be haunted by evil spirits and hunted by apostles until they joined the Abyss as well. The only places where they could be safe were places with strong positive magic, like that of the elves, and Godot's Ore Cave was one such place, which is why Skull Knight brought Guts and Casca there. When the swordsman woke up from his injury coma, he immediately went against Skull Knight's orders and left the cave, in an attempt to process everything that had happened during the eclipse. Guts was unconscious by the time his fellow struggler arrived, so he didn't remember being saved, and sprinting was all he could do to keep his sanity intact. Once he exhausted himself, he was set upon by the spirits of the dead in the first time in his life. He thinks it's a rehashing of the eclipse, considering he's never had to face something like this before, but as if on cue, Skull Knight shows up to clarify his misconceptions. From this day forward, this was going to be Guts' new life as a man that walked the boundary between the living and dead, known as the interstice. With the brand of sacrifice carved into his body, Guts was now a demonic sacrifice, and every last drop of blood in him was promised to demonkind. So, as long as he was alive, the brand would attract evil entities, like dead spirits that would try to take over his body if he let his guard down. He learnt that last detail firsthand, but Skull Knight was on hand to help him defend himself. He threw Guts his own sword, and as the Black Swordsman leapt through spirit after spirit, making his ominous war declaration, it became clearer to Skull Knight just how he'd survived the eclipse. His words regarding a man surviving with a broken sword in the abyss of despair came true, and he was now witnessing the strength behind it all. Guts must have reminded him of himself in more than one way, because the vow he just made to get those pale-faced bastards was one Skull Knight made centuries ago. Just as he was admiring the handiwork of a pissed-off, one-armed and one-eyed Black Swordsman, something unexpected happens. The spirit attacking Guts cease their assault and dash off into a particular direction. Guts thinks that it's over, but Skull Knight knows better. There were two people who emerged from the eclipse with the brand of sacrifice, and now those spirits were swarming the other person. Guts tried to muscle Skull Knight into temporarily handing over his horse, but considering the situation, the wandering wraith decided to do him another solid. He gave Guts a ride to where the spirits were headed, and informed him that this was now twice he'd carried him. Guts wasn't aware of the first time, and he didn't like favors. So, Skull Knight told him everything was incidental. That he met him during the eclipse was incidental. That Rickard had the medicine needed to save him was incidental. Skull Knight makes it seem like they have no control over destiny. But he's also aware that Guts has no desire to put his stock into such things, so he doesn't push his own agenda on him at the time. And trust us, there is one, and the fact that it's only been addressed once in Berserk is what concerns us. But we'll get to that in due course. For now, let's go back to what happened after Skull Knight brought Guts to where Casca was. The wandering wraith had expected to find a scene similar to the one he just saved the swordsman from, but what he saw was so unfamiliar to him that he had to stop Guts from going nearer. Several dead spirits had surrounded Casca, but not one of them was trying to attack her or possess her body. They were just circling her, as if waiting for something to happen. Guts grew impatient with all this cryptic casual BS, so he broke off and ran towards Casca, and that's when Skull Knight realizes what was really going on here. As soon as Guts reached Casca, she kneels over in pain and gives birth to a tiny baby, no bigger than a developing fetus. But this baby had a tail and a massive left eye, and it grew to the size of a human infant in about 2 seconds. The foe of the Inhumans informs his fellow struggler that his lover had been with child shortly before the eclipse, and because of what happened during it, that shapeless fetus was now infected with the power of evil. It had turned into a demon child, a cursed child. And Skull Knight's advice to Guts was to kill it because it was sure to bring woe upon them one day. Little did we know how true those words would turn out to be. But as he was saying all this, he saw both Casca and Guts struggling with killing the demon child, and when it disappeared with the crack of dawn, it hit him. Guts was the cursed child's father. Skull Knight informs him that the kid's disappearance didn't mean it was dead. It just meant that it had slipped back into the interstice. One day, it would return to see the two of them, because all children yearn for their parents, as do demons in their own way. This turns out to be true because in the very first chapter of Berserk, which takes place 2 years after all this, we see the demon child appear inside of Guts' prison cell in an attempt to get some fatherly love. With the sun coming up, it was time for Skull Knight to leave as well. So he did, but not after giving Guts more advice and a warning. He told him that they'd likely meet again, considering their goals were now aligned, whether Guts recognized it or not. The two of them were part of the same stream of causality, as survivors of eclipses, and their fates practically mirrored each other's. If he wanted to make good on his declaration of war, Skull Knight advised Guts to follow the brand, because it reacts strongly to evil. He also warned him that when one confronts darkness, one must also envelop themselves within it. Guts's was a black path through the night, and so Skull Knight wished him a good journey, because he knew firsthand just how much Guts was going to struggle with holding on to his own sanity. He pretty much shared that roadmap we mentioned a few sections ago with him, whilst also reminding him that his task involved the very real potential for insanity. And we haven't even commented on the fact that Casca pretty much regressed to a childlike state for close to 3 years following the eclipse. Skull Knight saved his fellow struggler and his lover out of compassion, out of a sense of duty, or just by chance as he likes to say, but it wasn't without a cost. Still, thanks to his knowledge of the other world, he was able to save 2 lives and gain an ally in his own struggle against the God Hand, the Struggler's Keeper, and a leaping fish, Skull Knight, during the incarnation ceremony. The next time we see him show up is shortly after Guts defeats Rosine, which is rare considering a Skull Knight sighting is like seeing an extinct animal still alive and in the wild. It's nearly impossible. In universe, 2 years had passed since Skull Knight last made himself visible to us, but in chapters, it had only been about 20 or so. But like all things related to the Wandering Wraith, there is a reason for it, because at this point, he's more like the Struggler's Keeper. Chapter 118 opens up with Skull Knight walking through the carnage that was the result of Guts and Rosine's battle. The trees, the bodies, the land itself had turned black because of the fire Guts lit up to help him beat the Elf Apostle. The Wandering Wraith commented that it was as if hellfire had scorched this earth, and considering there were corpses of dead children strewn all about, his assessment wasn't far off from what we think is the truth. He recognizes the struggler's footprints all over the place, and thinks to himself that evil fortune has still not forsaken him. He comments on the fact that for a man that walks Guts' path, it leads through an overly cruel night, and wonders whether a mere mortal can even continue to walk this path. Before we see what else he thinks could happen, his thoughts trail off because he spots something inside of a burnt-out tree stump, a behelit. Skull Knight takes one look at it and probably thinks to himself that he should eat something, because he pops the behelit into his mouth without even giving it a second thought. We're kidding, of course, because nothing this guy does is without reason or meaning, but we just wanted to impress upon you just how bizarre it was seeing Skull Knight swallow a behelit so randomly. Why he did it is something we'll address in the next section. For now, let's just talk about why we call Skull Knight the Struggler's Keeper, and how Guts changed his opinion on causality. Skull Knight didn't feel responsible for Guts' life, but he'd saved him on more than one occasion, and had also given him the means to survive in his new environment. Sure, he didn't give Guts a weapon, but he gave him the information that he needed to tackle the darkness ahead, and for the most part, Guts took his practical advice. All that destiny and prophecy stuff is what he didn't put his stock in, because, well, he just wasn't that kind of guy. Skull Knight seemed to think that causality was concrete, and that if something happened that he didn't foresee, that too was accounted for by its flow. He put too much stock in the hand of destiny and discounted his own actions from the equation. The Black Swordsman was the exact opposite of him in this regard. Guts believed in making his own decisions and choosing his own path, no matter how much it aligned with some great god's nefarious plans. At the end of the day, his will remained his own, and his actions spoke for it. Sure, his motivation might have come primarily from Griffith, but his desire to be the guy's friend also gives him a deeper understanding of himself. When Guts tells Casca that he can't rejoin the Band of the Falcon on a full-time basis, He says that he no longer wants to fight someone else's battles because he wanted every battle to be his own. Irony is a funny thing, because his war against the God Hand is a mix of both. He's doing it to satisfy his revenge, but in his mind, he's still the raider captain of the Falcons, going to raid the enemy camp. But let's keep this aside because we've already discussed the many complications of Guts' life in the entire Life of Guts video. This is about Skull Knight and how Guts helps him get started on changing his mind about the finality of things, because that's where the discussion turns to in their next encounter. The two strugglers meet again in chapter 142, 2 whole years after Skull Knight saved Guts' life from the eclipse. The wandering wraith had wondered back then whether Guts had some sort of connection to the elves, considering one of his mentor's dwellings was close to an elfin location. Seeing Puck with him now gave him confirmation that he was, and Skull Knight could only call that interesting. The reason Skull Knight showed up when he did had nothing to do with Guts, but everything to do with where he was headed. The wandering wraith already knew what was coming next, and he was wondering whether Guts and Casca would veer off the path of causality this time. Turns out his hope was in vain, because his assumption was proven correct. Casca had escaped her cell. When Guts asks Skull Knight why he'd shown up, he simply tells the man that he's the foe of the Inhumans, and one was known to be located where he was headed. The Black Swordsman follows up by asking if he was talking about an apostle, and Skull Knight responds by saying it was possible that he'd find their leader instead. He also says perhaps where he was going was also the land Guts sought. The Black Swordsman had been through this song and dance routine enough number of times to understand Skull Knight's cryptic way of speaking, and he realized that something major was going to go down at the Tower of Conviction. Guts thought that the entire God Hand was going to show up, but Skull Knight explained that that was not quite the case. As a massive body of unconscious thought, the God Hand existed in every place where negative human thoughts and emotions collected in droves. But because they were purely metaphysical, they were fleshless, and thus couldn't be said to truly exist anywhere. What he meant to say in simple terms was that the God Hand can't manifest into the physical world as easily as it can influence human thoughts and behavior. So, wherever people gathered in large groups, their influence strengthened. Guts, of course, was frustrated by him reverting to his cryptic talk, but Skull Knight wasn't done yet. The reason he brought up the God Hand's intangible existence was because they were about to make a play to reverse that. While entities that exist in the divine domain are usually restricted to that domain, there are exceptions to that rule. When the concentration of negative human thoughts and emotions reaches critical mass in a given location, one who should only exist within the divine domain is incarnated into the physical world. It happens once in 1,000 years, which means the last time something like this happened was during Skull Knight's eclipse. In this case, it was completely unforeseen because no one even knew about Void's plans back then. But in Guts' case, things were far clearer, because Skull Knight himself had dipped his toes into the current of causality. He asked the Black Swordsman whether he witnessed the dream of the Falcon of Light or not, and while Guts didn't, he did recall the falcon-like visage he saw in the Pillar of Flame prophecy given to him by his demon child. He connected Skull Knight's question to that image, and a floodgate of emotions was opened within his heart when the wandering wraith revealed that someone signifying the falcon was about to enter the physical world. He went on to ask Guts the whereabouts of Casca, and when he inquired whether she was already at St. Albion, he realized that the gears had once again been set in motion. He explains to Guts that what was about to occur was an event that traced a phenomenon within the divine domain that enabled the power of God to descend to earth. The sheep flocking to the blood-splattered holy ground desire one thing, which is salvation from their suffering. Within their minds, that salvation has been equated with the Falcon of Light, and so they desire his arrival. He tells Guts that he and Casca would come to throw themselves in the midst of that madness, and that this was essentially an attempt to imitate the eclipse. This sparks a dark gleam within Guts' eye, and he salivates at the prospect of living through that carnage again. Skull Knight tells him it wasn't going to be as simple as that. This time, his physical actions wouldn't be able to affect change, because the incarnation ceremony mostly occurred within the astral world. Its effects on the physical world were akin to the moon's light being cast on a body of water. So long as the moon existed, so would the light, which is just a fancy way of saying things were out of their control, and nothing they did could stop Femto from incarnating. He says what'll follow is no more than a shadow cast from a dying sun, and this festival was a thing that had already been set up ages ago. Guts asks him if the results will be the same as before, and Skull Knight simply says that their unexpected encounter was proof that they will. He reminds Guts that even men like them, who walked the line between life and death, still subsisted within the causal current, and they too were nothing more than shadows on the water. This reveals just how much Skull Knight has sort of given up trying to resist the concept of fate. Yeah, he can see it, he can interpret it, but his first reaction to anything that isn't supposed to happen is to either rationalize it or accept it as a part of the plan that he couldn't foresee. There's good reason for him to trust his thought process as well, because it's thanks to this awareness that he can even show up at the right place at the right time to begin with. But this is where the differences between the two strugglers also emerge, because instead of being a shadow on the water, Guts was more like a leaping fish. When Skull Knight's finished with his usual defeatist monologue, Guts throws back the finality of causality in his face by reminding them that all of his decisions were motivated by his will, not some unseen god. Guts reminds Skull Knight of his stubborn nature, bringing up the fact that he was christened with the name Struggler because he contends with the tide of fate so well. Besides, that causality business was pretty shady anyway, because Zod predicted that Guts will die at the eclipse, and Skull Knight pretty much expected the same, until he saw the broken sword in Guts' hand. The Black Swordsman acknowledges the help Skull Knight has given him in surviving so far, but he boldly asserts that this time he'll save Casca with his own strength, because he's decided to do so, not because she's about to trigger some sort of major catastrophe. Skull Knight turns away and considers what Guts just said to him, because he can see the merit in his argument. The eclipse itself was a major example of how not giving in to fate can lead to things even fortune-tellers can't foresee. The God Hand's reaction to Guts and Casca surviving the eclipse certainly tells us that they didn't expect it to happen, and so Skull Knight decides that Guts wasn't exactly wrong, but he wasn't exactly right either. Though they may be minute, singular details may occur at temporal junction points that even the God Hand can't foresee. He pledges in turn to gamble his faith upon those moments, because to him, these incremental discrepancies could eventually lead to a major shift in the causal current. He acknowledges the fact that though the incarnation ceremony could mirror the eclipse, its natural scope within the material domain was fairly limited, so they could take some steps to alter its course. On top of that, Guts' brand of sacrifice made him an interstitial being, which means that he exists with one foot outside the world of reason. The world of reason is what the physical world is called by astral inhabitants, and it's because in the aftermath of the collapse of Gaiseric's empire, reason overtook spirituality as the primary guiding force of life in the physical world. The astral world was separated from it, and so spirits and witches came to be seen as evil things, and not their original benevolent selves. But as men with their feet in both worlds, Guts and Skull Knight are not bound by the limitations of either. In turn, their actions have major implications for the path forward for the world, and Skull Knight only really accepts it when Guts gives him this perspective. But he doesn't depart with just the acceptance of this worldly truth, he also ends up giving Guts a warning. He tells him that fight or rescue, whichever choice he makes, his lover would be left alone regardless. It won't be as simple as catching two birds with the same stone, and having said that, Skull Knight looks forward to meeting him again at the holy ground where blind sheep gather. He completely read Guts' intentions, understanding with a single look that this man was going to try to save his lover and get his revenge, both at the same time. Skull Knight perhaps did the same thing when he was trying to keep the Lady Priestess of the Cherry Blossoms alive, so he knows from experience how futile trying to resist fate can be. He relays the complexities of the same to Guts, and makes his way to St. Albion. Armed with the knowledge that he can cause change in the world if he really wants to, Skull Knight decides to nip the incarnation problem in the bud by taking out the apostle that would be responsible for it. While Guts works on rescuing Casca from heretics, pseudo-apostles, and Father Mosgus, often at the same time, Skull Knight focuses on the orchestrator of this cat-and-mouse game, the egg of the perfect world. In chapter 155, he shows up right behind the egg and turns his joy at the sight of despair of his own creation into fear for his own life. The egg knows Skull Knight by reputation, so he knows what usually comes next, following the wandering wraith's arrival. He tries to make a run for it and hide himself within the burial grounds of St. Albion, but it's to no avail. Skull Knight's fought too many apostles to be tricked by such meager camouflage. He demands that the egg show himself, and proceeds to chop off his tentacles to establish who has the authority here. The egg tries to leap over him and make an escape, but Skull Knight's reaction speed catches the apostle with a lethal strike from his blade. So, the egg switches gears and kidnaps Luca instead, whom Skull Knight had rescued as he was pursuing the egg down the Tower of Conviction. The wandering wraith was worried that the girl had a death wish, considering how easily she let go of the hand of the people trying to save her. But that was overwritten by the form of the egg of the perfect world now. Skull Knight had never seen an apostle shaped like a behelit, so seeing one now confirmed for him that this was the apostle that he needed to take out in order to alter the course of what was to come. He chased the egg down to its lair, but was once again surprised by its uncanny resiliency. He'd given him a fatal wound to the abdomen, and yet the egg wasn't just moving, but doing so as if he were uninjured. But he was here for an execution, so he tries to kill the egg, who once again uses its superior speed to get away from him. This marks the second time he saves Luca in the span of a few minutes, and so when she asks him what was going on, he answers truthfully. He tells her that he and the rest were people that she and the rest of her world would do best not to engage with, but admits to himself that based on what happens next, that truth itself could change. He spots a raven holding a behelit, quite possibly the egg's behelit, in its mouth, and swallows the behelit before taking Luca out of the egg's burning lair. As if to prove his estimation correct, as soon as he surfaces, the blood flow of the dead begins, which signals the triggering of the incarnation ceremony. Skull Knight explains to an inquiring Luca that these things were the essence of the malice that permeated St. Albion, but what he neglects to mention is why they were here in the first place. A long time ago, The Tower of Conviction was under Gaiseric's territory, so when his capital fell, no doubt the people living around it also died deaths that were sudden or unsatisfactory. The collapse of his empire was followed by an inquisition, likely performed by the Holy See, which would have seen more people die unjustified and premature deaths. All that negativity had gathered up in St. Albion, and their concentration reached critical mass with Mosgus's latest inquisition. Once Guts and Casket arrived, it spilled over and triggered the conditions required to begin the incarnation ceremony. Skull Knight was shocked at how the blood flow had begun so early and so strongly without the use of an interstitial device, like a behelit, but this is probably where the egg of the perfect world's form becomes relevant. He looks like a behelit because he fills in for a behelit during the incarnation ceremony, which means he fulfills all of its roles, including bridging the gap between the living and the dead. Skull Knight does everything in his power to get Luca out of St. Albion because it was about to get swallowed by the blood flow of the dead. He tells her that she should stay away from the city if she values her life, but Luca just runs back off inside because she still has Nina to take care of. Skull Knight finds her triviality in the face of a potentially world-ending event to be an example of ignorance or foolhardiness, or perhaps the kind of courage he could never muster himself, though that remains unsaid. The reason for that is the arrival of Nosferatu Zod, which makes Skull Knight think that even if his help was solicited, he couldn't provide it, as all flowed as if parallel to that time. He sees hints of his eclipse event all across the incarnation ceremony, the mass sacrifice, the gigantic burning brand of sacrifice on the ground, the fact that a God-hand birth was about to take place, all of it reminded him of when he himself became who he is. And just like last time, all he could do was stand by and watch. Skull Knight's only contribution to trying to stop Griffith's incarnation was him fighting Zod for a little bit. As soon as the tower collapsed, he knew he could no longer affect things directly, so he just pointed Guts in the direction of Griffith to ensure his personal flame for revenge didn't die out. But though Skull Knight was unaware of it, he did help facilitate a major change in the incarnation ceremony, which was the unexpected inclusion of the demon child. Thanks to his fatal wound, the egg of the perfect world entered a sentimental mood and not only spilled his life story to Luca, but also swallowed the dying demon child in an act of compassion. This would go on to have a leaping fish effect on the causal current that potentially exposes the God-hand's only weakness, but we'll get to that when it's the right time to address it. Before that, let's go back to Skull Knight's odd behelit snacking habits, because they hold the key to understanding his real strategy for taking down the God-hand. A Path to Redemption and Farewell to a Friend, the debut of the Sword of Actuation, and Flora's demise. Throughout his centuries-long existence, Skull Knight figured out many ways to track the God-hand, but he would always come up short when it came to actually dealing with them. Like he explained to Guts, the God-hand was purely astral in nature, and so expecting physical weapons like his own sword to work against them was pointless. They'd be entirely ineffective. Dragon Slayer worked because it had been tempered in apostle blood, but most weapons just wouldn't. In order to battle astral creatures, one requires astral weapons, and it's within that context that we see Skull Knight's return. Following the incarnation ceremony, he pretty much disappears from the series until Guts and his party reach the spirit tree mansion of his old friend, Flora. Skull Knight had anticipated that at some point, Guts and Flora's paths would cross, and so he gave her a heads up on their arrival, considering all three of them shared a common overarching goal. After meeting the witch and getting some of his doubts about the behelit and the God-hand cleared, Guts started gearing up for his latest mission. In exchange for safe haven and a talisman that could dampen the brand of sacrifice effects, Guts agreed to help the old man called Morgan with his troll problem and take Flora's disciple Shirka along with him as well. The group were selecting their weapons and preparing for departure in Chapter 203, but one question was still nagging Guts' brain. Who in the hell told Flora that they'd be arriving? Right before setting off, he senses something and looks at one of the windows of Flora's mansion, where he thinks he sees a shadow. But then he turns around and keeps stepping, because that was more in line with his nature. Flora goes back in and confirms that it was Skull Knight, and tells him that he should have said something to the departing soldiers. He used to be a king, after all. Words of encouragement from such men hold a lot of weight. Flora knew better though, so she continued with her assessment of Guts' party, calling them all bold children. She asks Skull Knight if he was satisfied now, implying that the reason she prepped Guts and the rest for their journey was at his request, but he responds with his trademark stoic silence. Flora goes on to ask what stroke of fortune brought her old friend back to her, asking for a favor, and she playfully asks him whether it was someone else's sake, out of pity for a fellow sufferer, or whether he was simply using Guts. And this brings up an excellent question. What if Skull Knight was just using Guts for his own means? The Wandering Wraith had been fighting the God-hand for a very long time now, and making no headway, evidently. Guts was fresh blood though. He'd proven many times over that he was fully capable of handling situations like the Eclipse and entities at least as strong as his own eternal rival, the immortal Zod. And Skull Knight's soul had already shifted vessels once. What's to say he wouldn't want to shift it to someone that he sees having a better chance at beating the God-hand than himself? His knowledge, combined with Guts' strength, would create an unstoppable demon-killing machine, but thankfully that turns out not to be the case. Flora tells her old friend that she wishes the heart of a man still beats behind that steel, and Skull Knight's response confirms that it does. He tells her that even if he doesn't do it, Guts too might be one guided by the law of causality, and this explains a lot about his seemingly random visit to Flora. Skull Knight recognized the fact that though he'd been fighting the God Hand for 1,000 years, he didn't need to be the one who finally took care of them. He was willing to hand over that responsibility to someone more suited to it, like Guts. By this point, Skull Knight had come to not only accept but admire Guts' tenacity. His fellow struggler was capable of turning lush forests into scorched earth and survive encounters with apostles without the use of elf dust for quite a while, but he also recognized his very human limitations. If he wanted to truly stand a chance at defeating the God Hand, Guts needed weapons that would work better than regular steel against his enemies, and that's why he was here. While the Black Swordsman didn't take a weapon with him on his expedition, turns out his real assigned weapon wasn't going to be the axe of gnomes anyway. Once Flora and Skull Knight realized that the troll mission had devolved into an impromptu expedition into Cliffoth, they knew they had a very short window to prepare their gift for Guts. The wandering wraith departs to assist his fellow struggler, but not before asking Flora to get to work on what they discussed. That turns out to be the application of an ego-shielding seal on the dormant berserker armor, but we'll get to that in a moment. For now, let's go to Cliffoth, because that's where we see the emergence of Skull Knight's solution for his God Hand problem. Throughout this video, we've made multiple references to Skull Knight's odd habit of ingesting behelits. Now, usually you'd expect something that's being treated like food to behave like food as well. Behelits are essentially stones, and unless one possesses the ability to digest stones, if a regular human swallowed them, they'd likely pass it out with their stool in a day or two. It's hilarious imagining Skull Knight eating all those behelits just to poop them out, but as you might have guessed, that isn't exactly what's happening. The Wandering Wraith is an eerily accurate nickname for the Skull Knight, because that's exactly what he is. He's a vengeful spirit that's roaming through two worlds from the inside of a skeleton-shaped coffin. This also means he doesn't exactly have internal organs like the rest of us. The inside of his armor must be purely astral in nature, so every behelit he's ever ingested technically just exists within him. Only they're no longer in their original state. We'll explain. The reason Guts and the rest of the party had to enter Cliffoth was because during their mission to clear the trolls out of Enoch Village, things got out of hand. Ogres and Kelpies joined the party. Shirka nearly lost control of herself, and worst of all, Casca and Farnese were kidnapped by some trolls. The party tracked them to their den and ended up inside the astral world's region of darkness. Femto's incarnation as Griffith blurred the lines between the physical and astral, and the appearance of Cliffoth was only the beginning. When Shirka and Guts reached the entrance of the den, they realized the job was about to become far more difficult than anticipated, and once they reached their targets, it became evident. Guts stayed behind with the trolls because he knew he needed to give his comrades an escape route. Well, that, and he also wanted to finally let loose for a little bit. He'd been fighting with one eye on his friend's safety for so long, he needed to let off some steam, and he does that just against those poor trolls who think swarming the 100-man slayer is a good strategy. Guts clears up half of them and forces the other half into retreat when his band of sacrifice explodes with pain. Cliffoth is a place that's deeply linked to the astral world, no matter what sort of physical form it takes, and being connected to the astral world, it makes it the perfect place for a God Hand to pay a little visit to the world they were about to change. That's exactly what Slan does when she uses troll entrails to force an advent. Well, she also does it because she wants to see Guts, but that's beside the point. Even with a temporary body, Slan outclasses Guts in every metric. She snatches him up with her wings and tears his chest open, and all this time, she hasn't even moved her legs. She taunts him into stabbing her with Dragon Slayer, and then takes it a step further by suggesting he makes a sacrifice. Like him, he has a behelit. His anger, fear, malice. They made him the perfect candidate for becoming an apostle in Slan's eyes, even though she knew he wasn't destined to become one. It was perhaps because he foresaw her arrival that Skull Knight rushed into Cliffoth. He broke off a piece of his armor and used it as a shuriken, burying it within one of Slan's wings to get her attention. Slan playfully chastises him for interrupting the clandestine affairs of men and women before asking him if His Majesty wanted to join, letting us know that she knows who he really is. Skull Knight rebuffs her, calling her a whore princess, and is sort of relieved to see that she was the only one summoned. It made his job a lot easier, but she corrects him on one thing. She wasn't summoned with the use of an artifact like a behelit. She came here on her own. Slan goes on to explain that this is what the emergence of Femto within the physical world means. The barriers were starting to overlap, and soon the two worlds would become one. Skull Knight knows what she means by that, so he simply states that the time for talk has passed and draws his sword. Slan uses her woman's prerogative and the fact that she can insta-spawn any astral creature she wants in Cliffoth, considering it was like her womb, to try and keep him tied up while she finished with Gus. She birthed several dozens of ogres and trolls, but the Wandering Wraith's skill was far superior to their numbers. He made light work of whatever tried to stop him, and yet somehow, Slan's respawn rate was faster than his immense speed. At one point, she manages to surround Skull Knight from all sides and asks him if he was enjoying his hopelessness, but he simply replies by telling her that the time was at hand. Slan was so occupied with keeping Skull Knight occupied that she completely overlooked Guts, who had recovered just enough to aim his cannon at her abdomen and blast it at point-blank range. Usually, this is enough to mortally injure even the strongest of apostles, but this was a god hand's advent. Slan only relished the feeling and asked for more, which unnerved Guts. He was already bleeding profusely, and his best shot had just failed in his mind. Skull Knight helps him recover from that panic by telling him to not falter, and use his sword, tempered with the malice of thousands of dead bodies and spirits, to run her through. Guts catches himself and does as he's told, thrusting Dragon Slayer straight through Slan, and it causes her forced advent to dissipate. But because the life and death within her womb intermingled thanks to Guts' belly-splitting blow, the cave which they stood in turned into a chaotic hotbed of astral energy. Skull Knight informed Guts that if things were left as they stood, the entire region surrounding Qliphoth could end up getting engulfed by this chaos, and the Black Swordsman returned the favor by letting him know that the entrance was blocked. With no way out and no other option available to them, Skull Knight decided that this was the time to test something he'd been saving for the God Hand. As he swallows his sword up to the hilt, Skull Knight says that this weapon was only meant to entomb them within that vortex. Guts is utterly baffled by what he's seeing, because he thinks Skull Knight is trying to pull some sort of street magic to help them get out of a very serious situation. His eyes go wide and his jaw hits the floor when he sees the blade emerge coated with dozens of active behelits. We call these behelits active because as soon as Skull Knight pulled it out, his sword started resonating with Guts' behelit. The Wandering Wraith dubs this blade the Sword of Actuation in the Dark Horse translation, and he goes on to demonstrate just what he meant when he said it was meant for entombment. The reason Skull Knight had been eating behelits all this while was to create a weapon that would turn the God Hand's power against them and make it so that they never resurfaced in the material world. A behelit is a highly spiritual object whose interiors are linked to the abyss. The idea of evil is directly involved in their appearance in the physical world, and without a behelit, it'd be impossible to create an apostle or a God Hand. After centuries of fruitless labor, Skull Knight must have realized that this was the only way he could definitively beat the Inhumans once and for all, and so he started collecting behelits from every fallen apostle he came across. He refined them within his own body and turned them into a formless substance that he could coat upon his blade whenever the need arose. Like Chapter 221. A single slash from the Sword of Actuation opened up a one-way portal to the abyss for the chaos that was engulfing Qliphoth. Skull Knight and Guts were making their getaway on the former's horse, but because they opened up the abyss, the Vortex of Souls started chasing Guts. He yelled at the Wandering Wraith that they were gonna get caught when the scenery shifted and he was suddenly in front of his friends. He wondered what had just happened out loud, and Skull Knight replies to him with a short but self-explanatory answer. They just cleaved space itself and passed through another layer of the astral world. That was the true power of the Sword of Actuation, opening spatial portals. Before Guts can ask for any other explanations, he disappears, but we can guess what's going on in the Black Swordsman's mind. It feels like a rather simplistic solution to what's clearly a complex problem. Skull Knight is basically copying Void's abilities in a way, but for anyone that's paid close attention to the series, they'll know it's much more than that. The Sword of Actuation doesn't open up portals randomly. It specifically sends its targets to the abyss. It reverse engineers the concept upon which a behelit functions and allows Skull Knight himself to navigate through the many layers of the astral world as accurately as he wanted to. But it's the mobility that it grants which becomes the true ace in his hole, pun intended. The God Hand, while not prescient, can pretty much predict most things that are to occur within the world with astonishing accuracy. The only things they seemingly cannot foresee are the actions of leaping fishes like Guts and Skull Knight himself, so the key factor in defeating them then becomes the element of surprise. Skull Knight needed this especially because he had an established pattern of operation, and even apostles were now starting to anticipate his arrival rather than dreading it. With the Sword of Actuation, the element of surprise is his, and if he can catch the God Hand off guard, which is a massive if to begin with, he could likely entomb them within the Vortex of Souls forever. Over the course of his 1,000-year struggle with the God Hand, this is the only solution that Skull Knight could think of, and considering how little even trained mages like Dybert and Gedfring know about them, it's damn near a miracle that the Wandering Wraith out-magicked the magic users. But this is all theory until we see him take out a God Hand member with it, which we will in a few minutes. For now, let's get back to that gift we mentioned Skull Knight wanted Flora to give to Guts. Chapter 222 opens with a shot of Flora putting the final touches of a talisman on the Berserker armor's breastplate. She muses that it turned into a big job in the end, and talks to Skull Knight about the nostalgia of it all. The last time they used the Berserker armor properly was over 1,000 years ago, and now they were going to pass it on to someone who was walking a path similar to theirs. The wandering wraith reminds his old friend of the immense danger that this armor posed to whoever used it, and Flora acknowledged his concern, while also mentioning that that is what made it a necessity for them. The Berserker armor had the potential to turn the tide in the war to come. Gaiseric managed to conquer the world with it. There's no reason to not think that Guts would be able to liberate the world from the yoke of causality in similar fashion. But Skull Knight's warning still stands, because he knows the Berserker's effects firsthand. And moreover, he believes that he imparting the armor onto Guts was just his karma circling around to another, across the centuries. This is where Flora cuts him off and reminds him that he was deflecting back to his nature with statements like those, by saying that she believed karma to be a spiral, not a circle. Mistakes of the past were not meant to be repeated in the present or the future. And besides, there was no guarantee that Guts and his lot would make the same choices of Skull Knight and Flora. The Wandering Wraith agrees with their assessment, but before they have time to debate the spiritual intricacies of the concept of karma and causality within the Berserkverse, the time to bid farewell arrives. Being one of the most skilled mages in the world despite her age, and a guardian of a spirit tree besides, Flora was number one on Griffith's list of magical enemies to get rid of. To that end, he'd sent his war demons under Zod and Grunbel's watchful eyes to kill Flora. Being one of the best at what she does, Flora had always known that one day or another, the Falcon's beaks and talons would come for her. But she was shocked to see that Skull Knight still wanted to fight for her sake. She tried to remind him that regardless of what he does, her time on this earth was drawing to an end, and he simply tells her that's all the more reason for him, so she can pass with ease. This fills Flora's frail heart with joy, and she thanks her old friend for his devotion, which has extended well beyond their collective natural lifespans. He gets to work on doing what he does best, which is turning apostles into mincemeat pies. And no, not the fruity kind. By the time Guts and the rest returned from Cliffoth to Flora's mansion and realized something was wrong, Skull Knight had already slaughtered several of Griffith's war demon apostles. Guts tries to join in on the action, unaware of his fellow struggler's presence, but he's repelled with unnatural ease by an apostle. It makes sense when you consider his injuries from the Slant fight, but Gus doesn't care. And so, when the apostle he attacked nearly ate him alive for it, we braced for Berserk to have an early ending. That's when Skull Knight swooped in and teamed up with Guts to save his fellow struggler's life. When Guts asks him why he was there, the Wandering Wraith simply states that he has close ties with the head of the mansion. The pair prepare for an all-out battle when the gathered apostles realize their actual identities. But before a bloodbath ensues, things take a dynamic turn with the arrival of Zod and Grunbel. The Immortal One didn't expect to see both of his valued rivals gathered in a place like this, but he didn't mind because it only meant that he could finally have a good time. While Grunbel engaged Guts, Zod could focus on Skull Knight, and the Immortal One was itching for a fight. He even crushed one of his own soldiers' heads for trying to interfere, and ordered the rest of them to bring him Flora's head, even if it was burnt black. Skull Knight didn't even bother to acknowledge him. He just turned around and killed the apostle closest to him, attempting to chase the rest down, but Zod taunted him by saying going after a woman was most unlike him. Skull Knight retorted by asking him a rhetorical question, bringing up his single-minded obsession with battle. But Zod tells him not to misunderstand. The last time, they fought because it was his will to fight him. This time, they were fighting because Zod was the only one that could hold Skull Knight back. Their reasons for duking it out were different from usual this time around, and perhaps that's why they decided to go at it earnestly. Chapter 225 gives us a rare glimpse of their battle as it was happening, and the Wanderer Wraith's moves were so good that Grunbel started disrespecting Guts, saying he wished he could switch opponents. We see Skull Knight land a beautiful parry on an incoming Zod paw maul, and we're sure that the pair's duel was equally impressive as it unfolded in the background of Guts versus Grunbel, if not more. But the party was interrupted by Guts accepting SK's gift, and Griffith's entire War Demon squad being exposed to the Berserker armor for the first time. As the Black Swordsman showed off his new powers by smashing Grunbel's shield to bits, Zod was shocked to learn of this development. As soon as he recognizes the armor, he looks at Skull Knight and asks him if he intends for Guts to follow the same path into hell as himself, to which we get no overt answer, but clearly it's a yes. When Skull Knight met Flora in Chapter 203, he told her that even if he wasn't the one that did it, Guts too may be the one who's guided by the law of causality. This basically means that he sees Guts as the successor of his own bloody legacy, and SK knows that if that legacy is to become reality, the Black Swordsman needed a major upgrade. That upgrade came in the form of the Berserker armor, and now both Zod and Skull Knight put the fight on hold to see what wonders, or rather nightmares, Guts could perform with it. To their satisfaction, he manages to crack Grunbel's seemingly unbreakable skin, whilst also dispatching of several other apostles with ruthless efficiency. Skull Knight silently witnesses his old friend Flora's final act in life, as she turns into a massive wall of flame to protect the Black Swordsman party's retreat. With his farewell completed, gift presented and path to redemption regurgitated, The foe of the Inhumans prepared himself for the moment that he must have thought would end it all. It's bitter irony then that it backfires completely and turns into an issue for the entire world. A precarious promise and the greatest failure of his life. Skull Knight's bungled assassination of Femto. About a month after Guts and the rest escape from Flora's burning mansion, Skull Knight pays them a visit because he needs to give his fellow struggler a couple of pointers. Guts greets him and thanks him for saving his life time and again, though he isn't all too happy about it. He assumes that Skull Knight is here to spout off some cryptic prophecy or point him in the direction of an apostle again, and not check on his health. But to his surprise, he does just that. The wandering wraith starts rattling off the physical symptoms that Guts' body was exhibiting due to the usage of the berserker armor. Reduced eyesight, sense of taste, sense of sense, that sort of thing. Guts is just annoyed by this point that this guy seems to know everything about everything, but Skull Knight answers his questions anyway. He calls these telltale signs omens, and warns Guts that each time he fought as the berserker, light, voice, warmth, he'd come to lose many things. The Black Swordsman rebuffs him as always, thanking him for the advice but telling him to save it because the next time he'd handle things with temperance. But his emotions end up betraying him just a few moments later during the same conversation. As soon as Skull Knight brings up the possibility of Guts soon encountering Griffith, the berserker armor tries to sneak up on him, which shows you just how much he can't let his guard down. Luckily, he's broken out of it by the same person that takes on most of the responsibility for Guts and the berserker armor, Shirka. The young mage thanks Skull Knight for his help during the Apostle attack and at Cliffoth, but then cuts straight to the chase. Her mistress had told her that the berserker armor was an incredibly dangerous magical fetish, and yet she would stare at it longingly, as if recalling long-lost days. Shirka was a clever child. She knew that Skull Knight defending his mistress was no coincidence, so she brazenly asked him if he was the previous owner of the berserker armor, and he openly admitted that he was, while praising Shirka's shrewdness. He told her that they used to be friends, just like Guts and Shirka, and then he proceeded to give Guts a warning that pretty much confirms what happened to him. He tells the Black Swordsman that the odd within the berserker armor was pretty much like hellfire waiting to explode. Even if the fire was held back at bay for a few moments, the coals still smoldered and would nuke the user if he wasn't in control of his emotions at all times. He told Guts that even with an applied talisman, he should never make light of it, if he wished to continue existing as a human, that is. This basically confirms that the berserker armor is what turned Skull Knight into his current vengeful spirit form. Otherwise, there was no need for him to emphasize the whole continuing to exist as a human bit. He goes on to explain Griffith's attack on Flora, and says that as an entity that existed outside the world of reason, he was now akin to an author writing their own life story in real time. Only those outside of that story, like Flora, were able to harm him in any meaningful way, and that's why he attacked her with those numbers. It just showed how capable of an enemy she was in his eyes, and secretly we're pretty sure Skull Knight was proud of that. He tells Guts that if he continued on his current path, he was sure to meet the Apostles again, and then perhaps leading them would be the Falcon. This is what triggers that close call with the berserker armor we mentioned earlier, and seeing that makes Skull Knight verbalize one of Guts' biggest unspoken fears: to protect or to contend. Even though he hasn't seen the Black Swordsman struggles with his inner beast of darkness, Skull Knight knew what the emotion felt like all too well. He recognizes this eternal query that'll puzzle Guts' soul till his death all too well, as a fellow dweller of the interstice. But this is also where he offers him hope. Skull Knight knows that Guts is looking to get to Elfhelm, because that's the only place in this world where Casca can truly be safe. So he tells him that if he gets there, then the ruler of the elves, the Flower Storm Monarch, could restore Casca's broken mind. When Guts asks if that was true, Skull Knight reassures him, and the genuine smile you see on the former's face is the first in a long time. But the wandering wraith never says anything good without following it up with a warning about something bad, and that theme remained consistent here as well. He reminded Guts that all that came after the ordeal that was to befall, and even if Casca was fixed, there was no telling whether her wish would be the same as his. This ties back into what he said about Guts' demon child bringing woe upon him and Casca one day, but we'll explain that in the next segment. For this segment, we want to quickly switch over from this precarious promise of hope that he's given to Guts to one of Skull Knight's greatest failures in life. And yeah, it involves a running theme with his character as well, which you might have guessed from the title of this segment. The ordeal that Skull Knight mentioned was the end of the world of reason. Ever since Griffith's incarnation, the borders between the physical and astral worlds were collapsing. He was speeding up that process by destroying spirit trees like Flora's. But in order to bring about a true merging of the worlds, Griffith needed a major astral event. Skull Knight was aware of what was coming, and he had a plan to stop it. What he didn't anticipate was that he would be outmaneuvered. That's his B. Following his incarnation, Griffith was a war general working overtime to bring his dream to life. He made quick work of raising an apostle army and then using them to reclaim human land, thus ingratiating himself with them. He used the planted prophetic dreams about the Falcon of Light to his advantage and positioned himself as the savior of the world, ordained by God himself, which was verified by the Pope of Berserk, no less. His enemy was an apostle that possessed the means to create demonic soldiers through spirit possession and demonic mutation, and their final showdown was basically Berserk Cthulhu versus foe Jesus. Once Ganishka dipped himself into the man-made Behelit and turned into Shiva, it pretty much signaled that the physical and astral worlds were about to collide and become one. You can find out more on why the man-made Behelit works the way it does from our man-made Behelit anatomy video. But suffice it to say, Ganishka had essentially brought the astral world along with him on his second incarnation. The body of an apostle is linked to the abyss itself. The larger it is, the stronger a form it takes. The more power it draws from that endless well, and the link between them becomes that much more intense. Ganishka took in so much power from the abyss that his Shiva form skyrocketed into the clouds. He became a dam of evil astral energy that was directly linked to hell, and all Griffith needed was a way to unleash it. This is where Skull Knight comes in. We're pretty sure he knew all this was going to happen when Griffith cornered Ganishka in chapter 302. Major temporal junction points like this were things he could pretty much foresee, but because his enemy could do the same, Skull Knight needed the element of surprise by his side, which he now had in the form of the Sword of Actuation. Unlike the Eclipse or the Cliffoth incident, where his presence was exposed even before he could accomplish something concrete, this time his arrival was completely unannounced. After gaining all that power, Emperor Ganishka went insane and started craving the very thing that he'd been trying to get rid of for so long, Griffith's light. Though he'd drawn a lot of energy from the well of evil, Ganishka remained an apostle, and as his mind melted under the pressure of what he'd done, his instinct started craving the warmth of his creator. When Griffith flew up to Ganishka's head in chapter 302, the Emperor welcomed it as if it were the first embrace his mother ever gave him. Chapter 303 was a recap of Ganishka's life leading up to that moment, and it was honestly disturbing how powerful the connection between him and Griffith became toward the end. The Dread Emperor openly acknowledging that his entire life had been enveloped in darkness to the point Griffith's light was blinding him was a breakthrough that came way too late for the guy. And Femto using his divine nature to reassure Ganishka that only those who dwelt in the depths of darkness could discover true light. It's a moment shared between two demons, but somehow it's a powerful thing. And the fact that it's a moment between two demons is also what makes it so unsettling. Perhaps it was because this interaction was so consuming that we were completely taken aback by what happened next. But just as Ganishka submitted to Griffith's aura, the tip of the Sword of Actuation emerged from nowhere. Skull Knight used the most opportune moment in his opinion to catch Griffith off guard, and to be fair to him, his planning couldn't have been better. Heck, Zod was caught off guard, and he's pretty much Femto's shadow at this point. What betrayed him wasn't causality, but the pattern he himself had established in his centuries-long pursuit of the God Hand. Femto knew Skull Knight would come, because he always tried to pull something during a temporal junction point. It was to his advantage that his trump card was spatial in nature, because Femto's own powers were based on manipulating space. He turns Skull Knight's abyssal sword strike into a key that opens the door to the merger, and what he says about the whole thing tells us that as good as the Wandering Wraith's interpretation of causality was, it still wasn't anywhere near being perfect. Femto claims that one who had been reincarnated twice, aka Shiva Ganishka, and a stroke sword that reached deeper still into the spirit world, aka Skull Knight's sword stroke, have combined to open the door. This phrasing sounds pretty prophetic and set in stone, so there's no way Skull Knight didn't at least encounter said prophecy once in his life. In fact, it could be the reason why he was able to execute the sneak attack in the first place. But he either misinterpreted it or didn't know the whole thing, because he inadvertently played into the God Hand's hands. Skull Knight's Sword of Actuation was the missing piece preventing the birth of the new world, and once his abyss-linked sword stroke cut Ganishka's abyss-fueled body, it was game over. The great roar of the astral world returned the Earth back to the state it was in when Skull Knight was still Gaiseric, and maybe that's why he pretty much disappears from the series for nearly 60 chapters. The next time Skull Knight resurfaces is after Guts' party has reached Elfhelm, and Casca's mind has healed. But at this point, the question him as well as Guts asks becomes the same. What's next? Will he ever get his revenge? What's next for Skull Knight after the Elfhelm arc? The Wandering Wraith had once told Guts that even if the Flowerstorm Monarch could fix Casca, there was no guarantee that his desire would match hers. And the Black Swordsman was realizing that the hard way. The entire time that she was inside the Corridor of Dreams, all Guts could think of was how Casca returning to her normal self would only leave Griffith on his list of concerns. Protect or contend? That was the query Skull Knight had left him with once, and he'd chosen to protect back then. But now that Casca no longer needed to depend on his protection, the bone of contention within Guts' body grew larger with each passing day. He was getting bored out of his mind trying to pass the time on beautiful, peaceful Elfhelm, and sword practice was pretty much the only thing keeping him sane. When Casca emerged from the corridor of dreams, his first desire was to see her and hold her like he used to hold her, but that all evaporated when she took one look at him and screamed herself into unconsciousness. Turns out, the price for Casca returning to normal was that she'd no longer be able to look at Guts and not associate him with the eclipse. Guts desired to be with her, but she only wanted to get away from him, considering the emotions the mere sight of him invoked within her. So he kept his distance. It was during one of these breakdowns that Skull Knight shows up on Elfhelm, surveying the mixed results of a long and arduous journey. He's been there many times, so he knows that what appears on the horizon isn't just a pretty picture and a happy ending. But he isn't sure his fellow struggler understands that yet, so he decides to let him know that he should keep his guard all the way up. Chapter 360 ends with Guts thinking about how he can solve this new PTSD problem of Casca's whilst swinging his sword, and Skull Knight arriving to give him the reality check he needed. When Guts tries to be his usual confident self and show off his achievement of reaching Elfhelm without Skull Knight's help, the latter tells him to keep his guard up because causality has yet to converge. Before Guts can ask him what he means by that, the pair are interrupted by Gaiseric, who has that conversation with them that we mentioned at the start of the video. Once we get the identity establishment out of the way, the great guru, realizing that Guts wasn't taking his causal warning seriously enough, decides to give him a lesson. He takes Guts to see the creator of the Berserker armour, Hanar, because he wants him to understand just what and how much was at stake here. On their way, an old mage named Volvalba sees Skull Knight and thinks to herself that the old men's dreamy nonsense was finally coming to pass, which gives you further proof that everyone knows SK's real identity as Gaiseric on this island. But that's not the point. Once the trio reaches Hanar's forge, Skull Knight greets him with the familiarity and courtesy one old friend should extend to another. But Hanar just scoffs at him for still prattling about in his coffin. He takes one look at Guts and can immediately tell the boy doesn't even know how to use his creation properly, let alone fully appreciate the danger he was putting himself at by using it time and again. So he decides to give him a glimpse by striking the armor with his hammer and triggering a blood memory. What comes next is something we've already discussed at the beginning of the video, so we won't rehash the details too much. But suffice it to say, Skull Knight looked at his fellow struggler with a solemnity we haven't seen from him in a while, and the way he called himself a foolish king really makes you feel the weight of the burden he carries. In chapter 363, Skull Knight has a moment of nostalgia when he visits the tomb of his former lover and is met there by her current avatar. It had seemed that he's been to Elfhelm multiple times, because Danaan asks him if he was there this time around just to pay his respects. But he simply tells her that he was a wraith filled with hatred and the desire for revenge, a ruin of love and all good things. He wasn't here to bask in the warmth of days that were never to return, and the fact that he was saying this to pretty much what was left of his lover is what makes this entire scene so depressing. Guts, Shirka, and Gaiseric decided to leave the two alone out of respect, and on their way back, Gaiseric tells Guts something that he would rather not think about. We started the conversation by saying it seemed as though Guts and Skull Knight were well acquainted, and at first, Guts is his usual combative self. But then Gaiseric explains that the reason SK was the way he was because he was not of this world. Being an interstitial entity, his mind worked differently when compared to others, and only strong emotions like love, hate, and endless fury were pushing him forward. He says that perhaps the only reason Skull Knight pays any attention to Guts in the first place is because he sees himself in the guy. And considering Guts was thinking the same thing after witnessing that blood memory, Gaisric's next statement frustrated him to no end. The great guru told him that at the verge of death, he must choose whether he would allow his own fury to breathe life into him or consume him like hellfire. And this is where Guts' mind becomes stuck. He takes a look at Casca and knows that he wants to keep her safe. But then he swings his sword once and Griffith flashes across his mind. The choice between fury for life and fury for death was not one he could think of sitting on this breezy island. And just then, as if to give him a push in the right direction, the Moonlight Boy appears. What happens next ties together Skull Knight's first statement about Guts and Casca's demon child, as well as his warning to the former regarding the latter's true desires. We all know at this point that the Moonlight Boy is basically the manifestation of the demon child that was subsumed within Griffith's incarnation vessel. Every night of the full moon, the demon child takes over control of their shared body, transforms into the Moonlight Boy, and travels to wherever his mother and father are for a night full of nostalgic warmth. But at daybreak, he'd revert to being Griffith, and that's exactly what happened in chapter 364. Once that happened, Elfhelm's destruction was pretty much guaranteed, considering it was one of the final beacons of resistance against Griffith's authority. And all Skull Knight could do to defend his lover's homeland was keeping alive as many people as he could find. In chapter 368, we see him protect Isidro and Isma from a tidal wave of the blood flow of the dead, which has somehow shown up on Elfhelm following St. Albion. The Wandering Wraith explains that these blobs were akin to the foundation stones of the island, and that all he could do for them was delaying their absorption. Isidro still stubbornly insists upon fighting, and Skull Knight thinks to himself, while this collapse was destined, resisting it too was part of man's destiny. The last we see of him in the series is for a brief moment in chapter 369, where he's slicing up the blood flow of the dead long enough for someone to cast the Formation of the Four, which someone does, but the damage done by then couldn't be reversed. Half of the island had drowned by the time the surprise assault ended, and all of the magical creatures in its vicinity, save for Ivalera and Puck, disappeared. We don't know what happened to Skull Knight because we never see him in the aftermath, but you can rest assured that he'll return because he's got unfinished business. Whether he's able to attend to it himself is now the main question. As a wraith that has wandered the earth for several centuries, ceaselessly working toward a single unattainable goal, Skull Knight has had to accept a few things. The first and foremost of those things was that most of this world, be it physical or astral, danced to the rhythm of causality. So much so that at times Skull Knight discounts his own agency from the equation. That's how on point causality usually is. The moment he realized Guts was destined to walk the same path as him, Skull Knight accepted the fact that he didn't need to be the one who enacted his revenge. And his revenge was more than just revenge. It also involved bringing the world back to the natural order of things. The God Hand has been manipulating events for a millennium precisely so the world can reach a point where they control everything, down to the last detail. But a leaping fish like Guts swims against the flow of causality and actually seems to affect it to a considerable extent. So Skull Knight is okay with hedging his bets on Guts. But there are several things that remain unresolved with his character arc, mainly his rivalries and the fact that his screw-up with the Great Roar hasn't been addressed at all. While he's amenable to leaving things to a younger generation, Skull Knight's the kind of guy that refuses to go down without a fight. And besides, his sword of actuation could not just have been a Chekhov's gun for the Great Roar. A weapon of this scale and power needs to factor in the endgame of a series like Berserk, so it's likely that Skull Knight will only play an assisting role in the chapters to come. Perhaps he can finally jump a God Hand correctly and not get chumped out like he did in a chapter 304, because this time, he'll have Guts and countless Kushan warriors to back him up. The latest Berserk drop confirmed that the Kushan were on the warpath against the Falcon of Light, and in fact, Griffith's vanguard had already shown up at their western borders. With Berserk entering its final act, we can't wait to see what the resolution to Skull Knight's story and his rivalry with Void will be like. But we do know that no matter how things end, the Wandering Wraith will likely never find rest, because once his job in this world is done, it's straight to hell for him, as a branded soul. Yet there is a chance that defeating the God Hand could eliminate the Abyss entirely, so our best advice to you would be, stay tuned. Marvelous verdict, and that's it for this video. We know it was a long one, but hopefully we're able to put across just how intertwined Skull Knight's past and present lives are with the higher mysteries of Berserk. He's only appeared in a handful of chapters, but every time he shows up, you know something major is about to go down, and that's why we love him. But enough of what we think, we want to know what you think. Let us know in the comment section down below, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more Berserk content, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep struggling, strugglers.